I see you've got your newest books right behind you. They look amazing. How's been the reception of those since you launched them, I think, right around the last con?
Yeah, I mean, they got very positive reviews on Royal Road when I did the web serial, and so that's always positive to get a bunch of nice reviews while you're doing that initial release. Not as popular as Dwarfs, but who can blame the Dwarfs? I've got another Dwarf book launching right now.
So it's good to see you again.
Yeah,
Uh, okay,
absolutely.
you got a brand new novel about dwarves coming out? Like,
Yeah,
happy days. What's it
another one
about?
coming out. I'm also gonna be having a new series in an entirely different world starting to release this summer as well. But the one that's currently starting release is book 7 in the Dwarves of Ice Cloak. Pretty excited about it. It
No
picks up the
kidding. Wow.
story from about the end of the Mine Lord.
Okay. Wow. That sounds amazing. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Do you want to pitch anything here?
Yeah, well, sure. The title is Ice Vein. It starts actually 2 years prior to the end of the Mine Lord. So as the Mine Lord is wrapping up, this storyline is starting, and it involves a lot of the same characters and takes that story further into the development of Glint.
Wow. That sounds fantastic. Okay. Trey, for those who've never met you, give us a quick overview of your origin story and why there are so many fantastic stringed instruments hanging around you.
Of my origin story. I'm just a country kid who grew up in the woods of Michigan and fell in love with both folk music and traditional fiddle playing and storytelling, and ended up pursuing advanced studies in folklore, both in music and narrative. And that brings me through many years and trials to the current point, being both a performing fiddle player and a writer.
That is incredible. How many novels have you now put out? I can't even count them. How many have you put out now?
I think I'm somewhere in the 16, 15, something like that.
Okay.
So that's kind of the I think this, excluding one of my first books, which is a collection. I think this is my 16th overall title, 15th novel, novella,
Okay.
something like that.
That's
And then I'll
incredible.
be starting to release the next one as well. So there's two coming out this summer.
Okay. Gosh, it's just amazing how prolific you are. So, okay, the topic that you had pitched for this segment was going to be fantasy, folklore, and fantasy authors. What was going through your mind? What did you want to make sure we talked about?
Well, honestly, I think there's a lot of misrepresentation of the history of the genre that I see bandied about online in sort of semi-authoritative tones. And I have to get on board with what Sir Terry Pratchett said. Basically, this is the oldest form of storytelling we have, probably in the human experience. Fantasy, both as a genre and as a literature and as a oral traditional genre, is ancient, and even the literary tradition of fantasy is far older than what people think. This did not spring up out of the ground with Tolkien and Lewis, and they didn't found the genre. A lot of people would like to. I love Tolkien and Lewis. I'm huge fans, but they weren't doing anything new per se in the sense of creating these types of stories. It's been happening for ages. We can argue about how long ago, but some of our earliest literature, certainly our folklore collections and everything, the fieldwork that's been done shows that this type of storytelling is ancient. You can argue about some sub definitions and genres and everything like that, but we have a long history, especially globally. But I'm more familiar with the Western canon of folklore and literature. It's ancient, and we have a lot of great things to draw on inspiration from if we want to.
So let me see what it sounds like you're saying is that the impulse of what we're doing that lies underneath, well, fairy tales and folklore and fantasy and mythical telling, that same thing feels like a unifying impulse, but then it's applied differently, as Mark said earlier in this live stream about fairy tales have a different function than fantasy or fantastical adventures. And so Tolkien maybe pioneered or Lewis created a new strand or strain of how to go about doing things.
Yes, I'd,
What
I,
sort of definitions are you working with then?
I guess I'd
So I
have
like
to
where you're
hash
going.
out what he meant particularly by adventures, like the German Märchen, which is that genre of fairy tales or the different cultural versions of those fairy tales. There's tons of adventure, travel narrative tales included
Mark,
in
I
those.
apologize for misrepresenting you. I probably did, but please continue.
But I don't know. I would have to talk to him about, where he was, what his particular view of that was. But it's really hard to lump oral traditional tales because you have oral traditional epics, you have oral traditional fireside stories that are often, talked about as Märchen, the German Märchen. You have a whole variety of different subgenres of the oral traditional. But then you also have the early literary. So you'll get something like an Icelandic sagas where you have a saga of Grettir the Strong, which I would argue is absolutely a fantasy novel.
Okay. Would you say like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're like mythic fantasy?
They are fantasy, for sure. These people who were telling these stories knew that this was mythologized. Uh, I don't think they conceived of this as history like we would argue. People would try to argue that this is history, or they knew that this story about this Cyclops, this is just a good story. These are exciting, fantastical tales. One thing that distinguishes some of these stories is that they take place in a real world version. Like the concept is this is rooted in our geographical world, like a Harry Potter type setting. It
Right. Percy
takes place in
Jackson.
an alternate England, just like Beowulf takes place in an alternate North Sea region, or Grettir the Strong, the Icelandic saga I referenced. It takes place in an Iceland, but it's very much a fantasy story, just in the same sense that we have Odysseus having all his adventures in an Aegean Sea type of
Hyper
setting.
Mediterranean.
So but that's new, and it's also it would be a mistake, I think, to say that there aren't any alternate worlds included in early folklore. We see discussions of different worlds, and the portal fantasy is a very, very old style of fantasy. The portal fantasy is huge in folk tales. I mean, you can't hardly look at Celtic folklore without tons of its portal
Just
fantasy.
falling through everything all over the
Yeah.
place. Yeah. Same with like a lot of the saints, hagiographies and ancient stories, like they're replete with fantasy, mythic tale telling that wasn't trying to be historical, but it was absolutely trying to be real in a mythic or a fantasy or a spiritual, not to demean any of that sense, but they weren't trying to tell history the way we're like with a video camera, like trying to document stuff. They're trying to accomplish something different.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of storytelling, it's very difficult to try, it's an error to try to take our current conceptions of historical literary analysis and think that people in 1,000 years ago were trying to do the same thing. That's not really what was the case. And there are times when, not to say they never did, there were people like you look at, you know, the book of Acts was clearly an attempt at, you know, telling a history, but then you get other things that are clearly intended to be teaching vehicles
Mhm.
as
Yeah.
much as anything else.
Through a form of Hebraic fantasy literature, I guess. So what would you then say? Tolkien and Lewis and like everybody says, oh, they invented the modern fantasy genre, whatever. So what you're saying is the impulse or what this kind of storytelling is, it's forever human,
Hmm.
forever young. What do you think they contributed then? Or what would you say they did contribute that was so definitive that we've completely forgotten that it's actually seeded into everything that we get up to?
I actually think that one of the main things that, for example, someone like Tolkien contributed was his prose and his linguistic sensibilities. I think that sets him apart in a unique way. Obviously, he's a philologist, but his ability to create a cohesive, unified, poetic world it is sets him up as a giant in the genre. I'm not in any way trying to argue against him being a giant in the genre. There he borrowed things very blatantly. And I actually was talking to my wife. She recently asked me, if you had any, non-biblical figures in history you wanted to sit down with, because she was talking about how she'd want to sit down with Ernest Shackleton and ask him a bunch of questions. And I said I want to ask Tolkien, and I specifically want to talk to Tolkien and ask him what was his guiding principle about the things that he was just lifting wholesale from other sources and the things he insisted on inventing himself. For example, you get the story of Turin Turambar, uh, which is more familiar to people who are familiar with the Silmarillion or some of the unfinished tales. That's from the Kalevala. The basic story is taken from the Finnish epic, and it's pretty much just the outline of that story that he took and then he put it in his world. I want to ask him, when were you okay with doing that? And when were you not? And was it just because if you saw something you liked, you took it? I'm kind of curious. I would love to ask him.
What do you think his answer would be?
I think he might answer something along the lines of, "I liked the story, so what?"
So
Um, it's I don't think you can claim to ever be the originator of a narrative. Human beings, I like to think of human beings as a riverbed, a dry riverbed. You can put that dry riverbed any place in the world, but if you pour water in it, the water is going to flow in the same channel.
that's
And
cool.
humans tell the same stories all around the world because their hearts are have the same channels in them. And so when you pour water through, they'll come out with the same narrative concepts. Is any narrative essentially new? Not really. We tell versions of the same thing. And in my little chat, I'm going to have later on my event, I'm going to be talking about some of the like the Arne Thompson collection, which categorizes storytelling tropes through from folklore and arranges them and codifies them and then tries to connect all the dots between different cultures and everything with those tropes.
I love that metaphor. It's a fascinating metaphor. Does that come from personal conviction or from the breadth of expertise that you now have dealing with tons of folklore, or both?
I think it's something that I think I've been using that since I did my master's work, yeah, or back in those days. And I don't know if it ever came from something or if that's just my way of visualizing it. I think my wife, who also has a master's in storytelling, has a
Man,
similar
evenings and
belief.
firesides at your house must be lit.
We
I would bring the
we
beer.
we do have lots of fun discussions. Storytelling and narrative is well, we met in grad school doing that stuff. So, but the idea is it's my conviction, but it's also a conviction based upon study. And it's that when you look at the body of folklore from around the world and you see so many similarities, almost to the point where we're telling the same story, you can argue a couple things. You can argue that there is a shared ancestry to the storytelling, or you can argue polygenesis, which is the concept that people develop the same stories or expressions regardless of contact. So things can happen in more than one place at the same time or at different times that are the same. I think are reasons to argue both in certain cases, shared ancestry versus polygenesis, but I really think that if you breathe life into these lumps of clay we call human beings, we're going to end up telling some of the same stories always. Always we're built that way. That's why you run into, in my opinion, you run into Odin sacrificing himself to himself on a tree in that poetic Edda. I believe even he's pierced with a spear in that Edda while he's hanging on. You'll see these images and these things recurring, not because, my faith as a Christian, not because the gospel is false and just based on folklore, but because human beings will always tell these stories because there's something fundamentally true somewhere in there.
It sounds like a very sort of Tolkien thing to do, like see a story in another culture, like, that makes sense. I like that. It fits being human. Okay, Trey, this was fantastic. Thanks for jumping on. Where can folk find you online to get a copy of your books and sign up for the next one?
I have a website. I have a Discord. I'm on Facebook. I have an Amazon. Amazon is always easy to get the books from. If you're a Royal Road reader, I'm on Royal Road releasing web serials, and I'll be on an event in a little while talking more about folklore here.